Welcome to Nomad Knowledge Nook, where curiosity meets knowledge. If you're passionate about science, history, space, travel, technology and more, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and let's embark on a fascinating adventure together. Climate change has been defined as long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define Earth's local, regional and global climates. Climate change causes direct effects, including death and destruction through the impact of extreme events, such as floods, wildfires, and hurricanes/typhoons, and indirect effects, like disruption of plant and animal species, and individual trauma as people attempt to respond to changing circumstances. Direct effects, like flooding, may be quite noticeable, but the slow developing, long-term implications of climate change, such as increasing poverty and loss of biodiversity, may be less obvious but arguably more devastating to the world's future. Rural areas, described as sparsely populated, having low housing density, and far from urban centers, are transforming, with shifts in employment, socio-cultural factors, and concerns about the future of such areas related to infrastructure. Coupled with climate change, effects on rural communities are complex and worthy of understanding and exploration. While climate change impacts on rural areas are a global problem, in the global south there exists a large and growing gap between needs and action on climate change adaptation. This entry considers the impact of climate change on rural communities, focusing on vulnerability of these areas and their inhabitants, and adaptation efforts. The literature is generally considered, but specific attention is paid to cases involving the global south. Understanding of the experiences of the global south is relevant to strategies and policymaking elsewhere, as the threat of climate change continues. First, a review of climate change, with an emphasis on extreme events, sources of vulnerability and risk, and adaptation, is undertaken, given a review of the literature. Next, perspectives are offered on climate change's impacts in agriculture, with a focus on smallholder farming. A discussion of government, trust, and collective action in rural communities considering climate change follows. A conclusion with opportunities for future research completes the entry. Climate change impacts on rural areas, extreme events, sources of vulnerability and risk, and adaptation. Climate change is expected to worsen disaster risk and severity of events in the developing world, while climate change has and will continue to affect all of civilization. The most serious impacts of climate change are frequently seen in vulnerable areas, including rural places, with indigenous and disadvantaged populations being exposed to heightened inequality. Many explorations of climate change impacts focus on the global south and inequality. Masuda and colleagues considered an Indonesian case study, exploring behavioral data on risk factors as to how populations adapt to extreme weather events such as temperature changes, in terms of work health and productivity. Their paper investigated how temperature increases affect rural populations, targeting output, mortality rates, migration, and human capital. Socioeconomic issues and shortfalls in skills and capacities in agriculture have been noted as considerable vulnerabilities in rural areas. Tribal groups are especially vulnerable given reliance on agriculture, which is being threatened by climate change and poverty. Government programs can serve as effective interventions to help indigenous populations through integrating natural systems and human systems, aiding vulnerable groups in reconciling climate change with employment opportunities and agricultural demands. As an example, climate change has intensified agricultural drought, which has altered rural areas in ways that threaten food security. This has implications for global sustainability. Drought has implications beyond agriculture, necessitating water planning. On the other hand, because of climate change, some areas have seen more frequent and larger floods. Floods are especially damaging in rural areas from a business perspective because the business location and employees are both more likely affected by the event. Forest-based work has been affected by climate change, due to fluctuations in rain and temperature, the threat of forest fires, and the incidence of pests, with non-wood products being more vulnerable. Migrant populations may evidence vulnerability, and it is important to plan for their needs. Migration concerns in rural coastal regions can lead to climate change-related emergencies. The idea of eco-bordering, connecting anti-immigration sensibilities with supposed concern for environmental sustainability, is a development that is troubling, shifting blame unfairly. The movement of populations, climate refugees, from climate-challenged areas to the global north has been seen as a sort of reverse colonialism. Aging populations can also be a source of potential vulnerability in rural areas. This is a global concern. Focused on the vulnerable aging populations in Nova Scotia, Canada, and proactive planning for coastal climate change, the authors considered attempts to bridge the gap between vulnerability and sustainability in terms of infrastructure, programs and services that appeal to and are utilized by these aging populations. rural areas are arguably most known for their agricultural role. Smallholders are notably impacted by climate change, as discussed in the next section. Agriculture, climate change in rural areas and impacts on smallholders. The necessity of addressing sustainability in agriculture rests not only on ensuring the productive capacity of the earth well into the future, while also attending to the needs of an expanding human population. There is also a need to consider these requirements in light of climate change. There is a relationship between increased risk and proportion of rural population working in agriculture, related to the variability introduced by climate change. Any solutions must work as designed in developing countries, and specifically rural areas, for climate change to be reasonably and effectively addressed. Rural areas are not all of one type. In the Solomon Islands, economic uncertainty, combined with the aftermath of an earthquake, have made for a rather threatened insular economy consisting of agriculture and fishing. Adaptability, vulnerability, and resilience in this case seem difficult to quantify, making planning efforts problematic. The perception of climate change being an important issue to solve is less common in rural areas than in urban places, with some rural areas unsure or defiant on the point of the anthropogenic, human-caused, sources of climate change, even given clear and undeniable evidence of change. Generally, rural populations may not see climate change as a problem that affects them directly, mistakenly thinking they are somehow safe from it or that the matter is unrelated to them. Even in marginalized areas heavily dependent on the land, people may be more convinced by family viewpoints than science, so a seeming denial of climate change is more akin to information not being used. Other rural populations may be resistant to engaging in alternative agricultural approaches, for example, because they do not perceive benefits or reason to do so. In the case of wildfires, blaming management practices and ignoring the impact of climate change are sources of vulnerability. The key to solving this problem of perception and awareness may be in tying climate change concerns to the very real and well understood concerns that surround industry, agricultural business, and productivity, reporting about climate change with scientific sources, and being willing to call out untruths when they are uttered. Ideally, awareness leads to adaptation, which leads to resilience in rural areas. People in rural areas are aware of climate changes, and this is impacting their strategies and decision-making. Dumenu and Obeng evaluated adaptation strategies in 4 rural communities in Ghana using social and economic factors to assess climate change and vulnerability, focusing on local response efforts to climate change. Points of concern included crop diversification, non-farm second jobs, migration patterns and farm size. Adaptation methods such as water harvesting can be helpful in reducing vulnerability in rural areas. Awareness of potential hazard and having been exposed to past instances of a hazard may indicate receptivity to acting appropriately in the face of a hazard event, but in an era of extremes, it is possible that public receptiveness may have limits, given that extreme events can cause catastrophes that are beyond simple preparedness. Agriculture itself stands in a precarious state, with industrial enhancements to productivity accompanying trends toward environment degradation, and food scarcity persisting against a growth in productive capacity. Sustainability in agriculture implies making best use of nature's goods and services whilst not damaging these assets, but this also means making best use of the capacities of people to work together and solve problems. Sectoral, community-led approaches can be helpful to achieving sustainable aims, as does attention and respect for the uniqueness and complexity of places. Interaction with government, climate change, trust and collective action in rural communities, involvement in public space. Governments have an essential role to play in leading rural communities toward increases in adaptive capacity and improved resilience. Public administrators hold the responsibility to seek holistic and innovative solutions to maintain and enhance the organizational assets, the environment, and human resources, and this includes responding to the threat of climate change. Interaction between government and rural communities works best when government is not averse to making good use of local knowledge, which in many respects has served communities for generations and may hold important keys for appropriate responses to future challenges. There is a need to build government perception and trust to respond to community vulnerabilities. Where there are efforts to incorporate public participation in climate change planning, efforts should be meaningful and build toward outcomes that clearly improve protection of livelihoods. There is a public interest in rural resilience from a variety of perspectives. Generally, society benefits when rural employments are maintained, from an economic development perspective. Government programs can help with vulnerabilities related to agriculture, water and household economic conditions. Such interventions are essential for marginalized groups. Climate change should be incorporated in government planning for how to decrease vulnerability and improve resilience. Resilience in rural areas may be impacted by education levels, access to food and water and health, as shown in a case study in Bangladesh in development of policy strategies for government. among poor, impoverished farmers. Research, improvements in use of technology, and reductions in the marginalization of smallholders are all essential to responding to the threat of climate change for rural areas. Governments can assist with capacity building for rural interests, improvements in technology availability and utilization, and sharing essential information in ways that make sense for diverse populations. Rural areas are at a disadvantage for receiving warnings of impending hazards, and so are more susceptible to impacts. Information needs to be location-specific to be of greatest benefit for agricultural interests. When adaptive measures are instituted, instructions on how to use strategies exactly should be provided. Political instabilities reduce trust and do not lead to a sense of resilience for communities. A lack of trust in public institutions may yield shortfalls in adaptive capacity, which is essential for dealing with the impacts of climate change. Such a lack of trust may be associated with a denial that risks exist, or undue hopefulness given the serious threat posed by climate change and extreme events. There may be instances where different agricultural techniques should be tried, or some portion of the population may need to engage in alternative work to adapt to changing circumstances, to allow for sustainable communities. However, the media may provide a venue for climate change denial, which can lead to political gains. This creates a cycle where science and policy are questioned. This can undermine positive gains being made by government. Media framing of the threat posed by climate change is not always consistent, and this can have consequences for viewpoints on how policies and interventions are seen in rural areas. Still, the media and government can and should make clear the concerns about climate change, how they will affect humankind, and what may be done about the threat, to empower individuals and communities. Conclusions and opportunities for future research. Because rural areas are excessively affected by climate change, there are clear needs to allay such effects and adapt to them. Poor healthcare services in rural areas contribute to vulnerability. Additional research to explore the connections more fully between climate change and public health has been suggested and is worthwhile given continually evolving circumstances. Additional research is likely needed given disagreement on the role of gender in adoption of climate change adaptation strategy. Gender is perceived differently in different places, from Mindanao to Cameroon, and definitions and expectations vary considerably based on cultural attitudes, so context matters. It is past time to examine the damage caused by a growth-only economic mindset. Approaches to rural development have relied on community capacity for partnership with government participation strategies, aims toward expanding food production, and approaches focusing on welfare of rural residents. The general critical sense is that these approaches have failed because they do not take into consideration the need to move away from what are fundamentally unsustainable practices. Additional attention to food and ecological security, careful management of natural resources, resilient responses to disasters, and consideration of inequality and market failures are all needed. Migration is a key concern in many rural places, and such phenomena will continue to be affected by climate change. While a full consideration of resilience and mitigation is beyond the scope of this entry, these topics are essential elements of a coherent strategy for addressing the impacts of climate change in rural areas. These areas are relevant to discussions of agriculture, food production, and energy. Along these lines, there needs to be an understanding that social welfare is a public good worthy of support, removed from neoliberal, economic considerations. This is an essential point for addressing complex challenges like climate change impacts and vulnerabilities in rural communities, which overemphasize individualism and self-interest. Partnerships with local organizations may reinforce paternalism and dependence, which does not necessarily speak to the interests of all community segments. Rural communities, closest to the impacts of climate change in many respects, present critical early warnings to civilization, but must be aided and assisted given their own inherent worth, and their value to their populations and to all life on Earth. The importance of this topic should not be underestimated. Rural areas are responsible in large part for food security. So goes their fortunes, so goes the world. In this regard, a proactive strategy toward climate change in rural places, as evidenced in the literature included here, is essential. Thanks for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps us going, and we can't wait to bring you more exciting content in the future. Stay tuned.